By early 2026, the global economy was suffocating under the weight of two simultaneous crises. A bruising trade war had driven U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods up to 145%, while an escalating military conflict with Iran blockaded the Strait of Hormuz, triggering a massive energy shock. Against this backdrop, President Donald Trump touched down in Beijing in May of 2026. It was the first state visit by an American president to China in nearly a decade. The stakes for the American president were intensely domestic. Facing midterm elections in November, Trump urgently needed quantifiable economic wins to take back to voters, alongside a diplomatic exit strategy from the crippling, unpopular conflict in the Middle East. Across the table, Chinese President Xi Jinping brought his own set of urgent problems. China's domestic economy was faltering, desperate for breathing room and immediate relief from suffocating U.S. technology export controls. This historic summit arrived at a crossroads for the two superpowers, a moment that could mark a genuine repair of the relationship or simply a temporary truce between two leaders prioritizing their own political survival. The optics of the summit were designed to project undeniable economic momentum. A delegation of Fortune 500 CEOs accompanied the president, framing the diplomatic talks as a massive corporate deal-making session. To the press, the administration touted 5 specific victories, quickly dubbed the 5 Bs. They secured commitments for Boeing, beef, beans, and established a new board of trade alongside a board of investment. The headline aerospace victory centered on an initial commitment from Chinese airlines to purchase 200 American-made Boeing jets, cracking open a vast aviation market that had been effectively sealed off. On the agricultural front, Beijing pledged to purchase $17 billion worth of U.S. farm products over the next 3 years, while explicitly renewing market access for American beef and soybean exports. To manage this newly opened pipeline, the two nations chartered the Board of Trade and the Board of Investment. These institutional pillars were publicly presented as government-to-government forums, dedicated to optimizing bilateral commerce and removing non-sensitive tariffs. Add up the massive dollar amounts and the shiny new trade institutions, and the summit creates the illusion of a grand bargain, a total reset of the global economy. But if you read the fine print, the majority of these billion-dollar agreements are completely non-binding. They are memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, meaning they carry zero contractual obligation to deliver. This chart compares massive 2017 announced deals against the fraction that actually materialized. Notice how an $83 billion West Virginia MOU vanished when trade tensions escalated. Shifting to 2026, reality falls short. The 200-jet Boeing order sits well below the 500 aircraft anticipated. Even the new boards of trade and investment are remarkably hollow. Their limited scope focuses entirely on non-sensitive goods, conveniently ignoring China's deeper industrial policies, while leaving those punishing triple-digit American tariffs completely intact. This isn't an accident. Signing a superficial MOU allows both leaders to pose for the cameras and claim a domestic victory, without having to enact any of the painful structural reforms their economies actually need. While the press focused on the 5 Bs of agriculture and aviation, the true, unresolved structural battlegrounds of the summit were the 3 Ts: Taiwan, tariffs, and technology. There was also an invisible hostage sitting on the negotiating table. The U.S. desperately needed Beijing to use its leverage as Iran's largest crude buyer to negotiate an end to the Strait of Hormuz naval blockade. In exchange, China held its own devastating leverage. Beijing maintains a near-total monopoly on the processing of rare earth minerals, elements that are absolutely critical for manufacturing U.S. defense systems and consumer electronics. During the summit, Beijing weaponized this rare earth dominance, trading mineral supply chain guarantees to push back against strict U.S. embargoes on the advanced semiconductor hardware needed to train artificial intelligence models. Then there is the persistent friction over Taiwan. Despite the economic pageantry, China aggressively pressured the U.S. for an explicit statement opposing Taiwanese independence, while the American delegation carefully maintained their policy of strategic ambiguity. Beneath the fanfare of trade normalization, the summit functioned as a high-stakes hostage exchange. Global supply chains and Middle East shipping lanes were tossed back and forth as raw bargaining chips. The Beijing summit resulted in a carefully managed stalemate, calibrated to halt a total bilateral freefall. Xi Jinping categorized this approach as constructive strategic stability. It represents a mutual realization that total economic decoupling is simply too painful for global markets and domestic populations to endure. At the same time, genuine, long-term cooperation is politically impossible. Both leaders are constrained by intense domestic pressures and nationalist bases that reward a hardline stance against the other. This establishes a distinct rhythm for the U.S.-China relationship moving forward. It is an ongoing, structural Cold War over artificial intelligence, Taiwan, and global hegemony, periodically interrupted by highly choreographed leader-level summits. These diplomatic events function strictly as pressure release valves. They utilize billion-dollar preliminary deals to appease voters and buy precious time before the next inevitable clash. The 2026 Beijing Summit effectively institutionalized an unwinnable economic war, cementing the rivalry into a permanent state.